let's go to Matthew chapter 24 and 25. And I want to again point out that what we've got in Matthew chapter 24 and 25 is an answer to one question. Now, Christ went a little further than they asked, because verse 3 of Matthew 24 says, as he, Jesus, was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? That is, when will the stones of the temple not be knocked over, that kind of thing. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so Christ talked about that, and then also talked about the judgment, not only the end of the age, but the judgment that begins the millennial kingdom, if you will. So Christ is going to go a little farther here than they asked. So one of the is we go down, and another thing about this answer, which is kind of strange, is he skips the Battle of Armageddon. So he goes right from the tribulation to the judgment, and he portrays the judgment in different ways. So we start out Matthew 24, and then he talks like verse 5, many are going to come in my name. Verse 6, you'll hear about wars. Verse 7, group will rise up against group. Verse 9, they'll hand you over to be tortured. All this stuff is the tribulation. So then he goes down and he talks about the coming of the Son of Man. And in this teaching, if you will, Christ calls himself the Son of Man. So he says in verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heaven will be shaken, and then the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet blast, and they will gather together, his chosen ones from the four winds, from the one end of heaven to the other. Now, when he talks here about his second coming and what he's going to do and gather together his chosen ones, we got to remember that 24 and 25 are the same teaching. You know, sometimes we read something in 24 and we think, well, there's got to be a couple days break or something between these chapters, and there's not. This is just one single teaching. So here he's talking about the chosen ones are going to be gathered. In just a few paragraphs, he's going to be talking about everyone that has survived the tribulation will be gathered. So what he's going to do now is he's going to tell some parables or parallels, illustrations about what's coming. And so the first illustration is there's a fig tree, and if you see the leaves on the fig tree, you know that the summer is near. If you see these signs, you know that my coming is near. And then in verse 24, very important, he gives the illustration of the days of Noah. And this is going to fit quite tightly into where we're going tonight, which is the sheep and goat judgment. Because if we read verse 39, you've got the people on earth before the flood, they're all evil. Verse 39, and they did not know what was coming until the flood came and took them all away. And that's a huge key in understanding Matthew 24 and 25, that the ones who are taken away are the evil ones, and they're taken away to judgment. And that's true here in Matthew 24, and it's true in Matthew chapter 25. And then he goes on, be faithful and be ready in chapter 24 to close out the chapter. Then chapter 25 and two parables, the parable of the 10 virgins. And basically there are foolish virgins and there are wise virgins. And the bottom line is that the wise virgins get into the kingdom and the foolish virgins are closed out of the kingdom. And then he tells the parable of the talents, and you have the wise people who use their talents and the foolish person who doesn't use his talents. And the same thing, verse 30, it says, and cast the worthless slave out into the darkness outside. There will be sobbing and gnashing of teeth. In the darkness outside, there's only inside and outside. You're either inside, you're in the feast with the Lord, you're in paradise, or you are outside where you are thrown into the lake of fire. And that's why there's sobbing and gnashing of teeth. So then we get to the closing illustration here in his teaching on coming, his coming. And there's so much kind of tightly packed into this. It says, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. A couple things that we can reflect on in here. One is, and all his angels with him. Now, Jesus had taught several times about the fact that when he came in his second coming, he will come with an army of angels. And of course, we'll look at that in Revelation 19, but let's see first in Jesus' own teaching. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 16. And in Matthew chapter 16, Christ is teaching about various things. It's in Matthew chapter 16 that Peter first confessed that Christ said, who do you say that I am, Peter? Verse 16 says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And in verse 20 says, then he ordered the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. So Matthew 16 is the start of when the apostles really knew who they were following, the Messiah. Of course, we learned from the record that they didn't know much about him. It's kind of like people who go to church and hear, miss teachings for so long, they really don't know much about the truth. The people of the first century church, or first century actually, did not know much about the Messiah. And that would include Peter, because once they find out he's the Christ, then Christ, verse 21, began to make known to his disciples he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the experts in the law and be killed. And they knew nothing about it. Peter takes him aside. That can't be, Lord. That's not going to happen to you. Then Christ talks about in verse 24 the cost of disciples, being a disciple. And then verse 27, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. So here's Christ teaching the apostles early on that when he comes in his second coming, he's going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father. So there'll be tremendous glory with Jesus Christ as well. So then we would ask ourselves, where did Jesus learn that he would come with angels? That when he came back in his second coming, how did he know he was going to come with angels? Is that direct revelation that God gave him and showed him? And the answer is no. That's in the Old Testament. That's part of the Old Testament teaching. Let's go to Zechariah. And if we go to Zechariah chapter 14, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, second to the last book in the Bible, last chapter in the last book of the Bible. And in verse 5, we can just start with verse 1. Zechariah says, behold, the day of Yahweh is coming, and the day of Yahweh is what you and I in this context knows is both the tribulation and Armageddon. In verse 2, I'm going to gather all the nations against Jerusalem into battle. This, by the way, is something we need to pay attention to, because you guys may know, I've said it before, I get both the Jerusalem Report and the Jerusalem Post every week, and I stay current on what's going on. And one of the things, I just read an article today, actually, in the Jerusalem Post about the fact that not only are the Jews astonished, but the enemies of the Jews are astonished at the international hatred of Jews. that countries around the world that have nothing to do with Israel all of a sudden have decided that Israel is the bad person, that needs to be done away with. Well, that's stage lighting for this. The day of Yahweh is coming. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem in battle. The rumblings of that are certainly out there at this point. The city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women raped, half the city will go out into captivity. This is something that we would have thought of as impossible a couple of years ago. In the modern world, does one nation really take captives of another? But then all of a sudden, here comes October 7, and in 2023 or 2024, I guess 2023, and all these captives were hauled off into Gaza, and the international community did absolutely nothing. And so is this a possibility? Is this something that we see kind of stage lights? And the answer is yes. Verse 3, then Yahweh will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights in the day of battle. That's Armageddon. When it says Yahweh will go out and fight, this is the law of agency. Yahweh will fight in the person of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. We read in Revelation 19, Jesus Christ is going to come down, fight the Battle of Armageddon. Verse 4, his feet will stand that day on the Mount of Olives that's before Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, making a very great valley. Half the mountain will move north, half south, and then that is a precursor to what's coming when Christ sets up the temple, because then water will flow from the temple according to the prophecies, particularly in Ezekiel. The water will flow from the temple down the east slope of the mountains that lead to the Dead Sea, and the water will go into the Dead Sea. So this is Christ fighting. And did I get to? Yeah, I read verse 14:5, because verse 5, the last sentence, Yahweh my God will come again in the person of the Messiah, and all the holy ones with him. Now, you and I today are called holy ones, but nobody back then knew that. What they knew was holy ones were the angels. So here we have a prophecy of the end times and Jesus Christ coming to fight the Battle of Armageddon. And the prophecy is that the angels will be with him. So then Christ could teach that in Matthew 16. He could teach that in Matthew chapter 25. And if we go to Revelation, if we hop over to Revelation chapter 20, then we can see Jesus Christ coming. And let's see, why am I'm out chapter late, no wonder. Let's go to Revelation chapter 19. I'm sitting there going, what? Okay, Revelation chapter 19. Sorry about that. Verse 11, I saw the heavens open, and behold, a white horse, and he was sitting on it. Is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were a flame of fire. On his head were many diadems, and his many crowns. He has a name written that no one knows but he himself. He's clothed in a robe sprinkled with blood. We'll see that again in a second. And his name is called the Word of God. Verse 14, the armies that are in heaven followed him on white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. That army, plural, armies, includes the angels. And in this context, it includes you and I, because this is after the rapture. And once we're raptured to be with the Lord, then we're always with him. So when he's in heaven, we're in heaven. When he comes down, we come down. So verse 15, out of his mouth came a sharp broadsword, so that with it he can strike down the nations, and he will shepherd them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God, the Almighty. And I don't have time to develop this now, but you can look it up in commentary when it talks about the winepress of the wrath of God. That is a moniker for the Battle of Armageddon. And you can track that all the way from the book of Isaiah, that the winepress is the Battle of Armageddon. So he's fighting here and fights the Battle of Armageddon. And what happens, verse 19, I saw the beast, that's the man we know as the Antichrist, and the kingdom he rules over, and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. So Jesus Christ and his angels and us will be fighting in the Battle of Armageddon. Verse 20, the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet who did the signs in his sight, with which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshiped his image. Verse 20 continuing, and this is important too, these two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. And in the record of Scripture, these are the first two people that are ever thrown into the lake of fire. Up until this time, the lake of fire is never mentioned in the Scripture as being except in prophecy. And we have no evidence that the lake of fire existed until the final days in God's judgment. And I think we're all familiar with the traditional Christian teaching that ever since Christ resurrected, sinners, people who died unsaved, were thrown into hell, the lake of fire. That's Christian mythology. It came out of, well, the actual long-term genesis of this is Egypt. As far as people have been able to research, the concept of an immortal soul that could live on after the body died started in Egypt. It moved over to Greece, and between Homer and Hesiod and many of the Greek poets, that became a big deal, the thing called immortal soul. If you look in the Bible, there's not a single place that the soul is called immortal. Not only that, if you read verses like Matthew chapter 10, 28, it says, don't fear a person that can only kill your body. Fear God, the one who can destroy your body and soul in Gehenna, the lake of fire. So the soul gets destroyed. My point being that there isn't any lake of fire until here. And these two are the first ones thrown in. So if we go back to Matthew now, chapter 24, Matthew chapter 25. So we're back to the sheep and goat judgment. Now we've got the Son of Man. He's come in his glory and all his angels with him, and he will sit on his glorious throne. And indeed, the throne is very glorious, and it's more important than what for years and years I didn't give the throne. It's a throne. Throne is a throne. It's like what? But interestingly enough, from God's perspective, what was promised to continue was the throne of David. If we go back to 2 Samuel, chapter 7. And this becomes pretty important to track. And like I say, it was only several years ago that I really paid attention to this. And I can't remember who got me. It may have been Bill Schlegel who pointed this out to me. I don't even really remember. But if we go to 2 Samuel chapter 7, and here's Nathan talking to David. And if we go to verse 13, verse 12, Nathan says to David, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers. So that's David, you're going to die. I'm going to raise up your seed after you who will proceed out of your body, and I will establish his kingdom. That ended up being Solomon. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. This becomes very important because the lineage of David did not stay on the throne of David. When the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, burned the temple down, killed the king, carried another king into captivity. That was Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin was the last king from the line of David to sit in Jerusalem on the throne of David. So, and then that was we were done. There was no more kings of David ruling in Jerusalem from about 580, well, a little later than that, maybe 530, 540, somewhere in there. But anyway, from that point forward until today, even, no king has sat on the throne of David in Jerusalem. So that throne has been vacated for more than 2,500 years. Yet God said that your throne will be established forever. That's one of the reasons. If we go to Luke chapter 1, and we start asking ourselves, we know that the word Messiah simply means anointed. So, the question then becomes, how did the angel tell Mary, make it clear to Mary that she was going to have the Messiah? If he said you're going to have the Messiah, the Christ, there had been a lot of anointed ones. If she said you're going to have the king, okay, there have been a lot of kings. What could the angel say to Mary that would grab her attention and say, wow, I'm really going to give birth to the Messiah, the Son of God? And if you look at verse 35 of Luke chapter 1, the angel answered and said to her, to Mary, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. And for that reason, I missed it by a verse or two. For that reason, the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. I was looking for verse 32. So verse 31, you will conceive in your womb, give birth to a son. You will call his name Jesus. Verse 32, he will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David. And at the time this angel's talking to Mary, that throne had been vacant for over 500 years. Now it's been vacant for over 2,500 years. But the promise that should have just sparked Mary's mind like boom was, I'm going to give your son the throne of David. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 25. And so that's what's going on here when verse 31 says, he will sit on his glorious throne, because that was the throne that was promised to David, the throne that was promised to be an everlasting throne representing an everlasting kingdom. Verse 32, Jesus is sitting on his throne. He's now going to judge the people. Verse 32, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Remember back in chapter 24, when Jesus Christ talked about his coming, he said in verse 31, he'll send out his angels with a loud trumpet blast, and they will gather together his chosen ones from the four wind, from the one end of heaven to the other end of it. And so when Jesus Christ comes and he's sitting on his throne, here in verse 31, he's going to gather together his chosen ones. The more complete picture in Matthew 25. Remember, it's still part of the same teaching. Matthew 24 and 25, one teaching. He's going to sit on his glorious throne, verse 31. The nations will be gathered before him. All the nations. So this is everybody. So basically, if you're a human being and you live in the end days and you aren't raptured into heaven as part of the Christian church, and you are alive after the tribulation, because most people on earth will die in the tribulation. But if you're alive in the tribulation, then you're going to be gathered before Christ for this judgment. And then verse 32 again, it says, he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates sheep from goats. Now, that's a little easier to do in the biblical world than it is in our world, because biblically, goats were usually black and sheep were usually sheep color, kind of a off-white. So it was pretty easy to tell who was a goat and who was a sheep. And so he's going to separate them. So the question is Is this some kind of new teaching? Is Jesus introducing this idea that at the judgment, there's going to be a separation between the sheep or the righteous who are going to be allowed into the kingdom and they're going to live forever, and the goats who are going to be hauled off to the lake of fire and disappear? Is this a new teaching? And the answer is no. It's actually in many places in the scripture. We can go to Psalm 1, for example. Let's go to Psalm, just the very first Psalm, which I think of many times in my life, kind of reveal a little bit about many times in my life. I've started out on New Year's Eve saying, okay, I'm going to read a Psalm every day until I get through all 150 of them. I've never done it yet. I've read all 150 Psalms many times, but I've never read one Psalm every single day for 150 days because I always get distracted and start reading something else. So anyway, so verse 1, here's blessed is the person. Verse 2 is delights in Yahweh's law. What's going to happen to him? He's going to be like a tree planted by the streams of water. By the way, the word planted there is not, it's not saying he will be like a tree that grows naturally by the streams of water. The word planted there, we tossed around. Should we translate that transplanted? The point is, it's like God picks up the person and says, where can I stick this person where they will be firm, they will be stable, they will last? I'm going to stick him over here. And he sticks them right by the river where then they live happily ever after. So this is the righteous person is transplanted by God into a place where they can live and thrive. And that's what happens to us when we're at the rapture. Poof, we get brand new bodies. We get raptured into heaven. We're with Christ forever. He comes back to earth. We go back with him, that kind of thing. And then verse 4, it's not so with the wicked. They are like the chaff that the wind drives away. And what happens to the chaff when you go through the threshing process? You have these little pieces of grain. That's the chaff. The chaff, and it blows them away. And where are they? Well, they're gone. Well, what eventually happens to the chaff? Well, most of it is eventually rounded up and burned in the fire because it burns very hot very quickly. It's good for making their little flatbreads and that kind of thing. So here already in Psalm 1, we see the separation between the righteous and the wicked. Christ did a lot of teaching on this. Let's go to Matthew chapter 13. In Matthew chapter 13, one of the parables he taught was the parable of the good and bad seed. Starts in Matthew chapter 13, verse 24, and goes to verse 30. And then you see the good and bad seed parable explained. And he says, verse 40 of Matthew 13, therefore, just as the weeds are gathered up and burned with the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels. This is parallel to what we see in Matthew 25. It's the angels who gather up the people. Verse 41 of Matthew 13, the angels gather out of his kingdom every stumbling block, those who are guilty of lawlessness, and will throw them into the fiery furnace. Verse 43, then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. So here in Matthew 13, we see basically the same thing we see in Matthew 24 with Noah's flood, where the wicked are taken away and the righteous are left. We see the same thing here in this parable. The wicked are gathered up and burned. The righteous are led into the kingdom. We see the same thing a little bit farther down in verse 47. Furthermore, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and gathered fish of every kind. When it was filled, they dragged it up on the shore, sat down and gathered the good fish into containers, but the bad they threw away. Verse 50 tells us where they throw them away. Well, same actually, verse 49. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the midst of the righteous. The angels gather up the people. Christ judges them, and then the angels separate them out. Verse 50 will throw them into the fiery furnace. where there will be sobbing and gnashing of teeth. So there's good fish and bad fish. My point is that my point is really that Christ was teaching in Matthew chapter 25 a truth that had been taught and known for a long time. And in preparing for this teaching and reading all these teachings and going over that, I I had a real personal time of just thinking about how serious this is. You know, sometimes, yeah, sometimes I think about the day of judgment. And it's like, yes, I know, you know, the good people were going to be saved and the bad people are going to be unsaved. And sure, but these teachings are so graphic and they're so impacting, and I became quite emotional because there's a lot of really nice people on the face of the earth who just want nothing to do with Jesus. It's like, I got everything I need. I just having a good time. I don't need to go to church. I don't need to give my life to Christ. I don't, you know, and they don't realize it's like, don't sit there and tell me you don't have a need. You can't get yourself up from the dead. You can't keep yourself from being thrown in the lake of fire. Jesus Christ died so you wouldn't be thrown in the lake of fire. And you have the opportunity to live forever in a brand new body with wonderful people and wonderful food and a wonderful place forever. And you just have to realize and humble yourself and say, you know, I am a sinner. Based on that, I do deserve to die. And also, I don't have the power to raise myself from the dead. So it would be a really good thing to accept Jesus Christ and be raised from the dead and allowed into paradise forever. And, you know, you read all these records, and then I went through this thing where I was like, okay, God, you know, to somebody reading this stuff, it can be really scary. And so then I went through a period of time where I was thinking about, you know, because I've taught for years that God doesn't try to scare people out of hell. God says so many good things about paradise. He wants us to focus and say, you know, it's like, I want that. You know, I was sitting watching TV with my wife the other night, and I had the absolute strongest craving for chocolate ice cream. Not that we had any in the house. We didn't. But it was just like all of a sudden it was like, and I really wanted chocolate ice cream. And, you know, as I reflected on that, I thought, you know, that's the way I should feel all the time about the hope and wanting to be with Christ. I want a brand new body. By the way, I'm 74 years old. I'd love a brand new body. I want a brand new body. I want to be with my friends. I want to be in paradise forever. I want to be in a place where there's no worry, no anxiety, you know, and like it says in the prophets, everlasting joy will chase them down. I want that, you know, but I want that for others too. What a lonely place paradise it would be if all of our friends and neighbors and relatives weren't there with us. And so I prayed a lot about, God, please open doors. I mean, here we are going into Thanksgiving and Christmas. This is the easiest time of the whole year to talk to people about Jesus Christ. Absolutely the easiest time in the whole world. And to just pray. And I've been just praying. And I told Jerry the other day, and I'll tell you guys this because I usually pray like I am right now. I usually pray sitting in my easy chair and stuff. But I haven't gotten on my, actually physically gotten on my knees in years. And I got on my knees the other night, and well, it wasn't even the night, it was late afternoon, and just prayed and just poured out my heart. And, you know, I don't know if there's anything especially holy about that. It's just something that I guess I needed to do for myself. But this is serious stuff. Every person who's alive is either going to live forever or die forever. And we should want as many people to live forever as is possible. Well, I'm kind of getting off track here. So I was talking about how, you know, there's this separation that we see in Matthew 25 between the sheep and the goats is very real. And then verse 33 of Matthew 25 says, and he will put the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. there's two things going on here. One is the separation of sheep and goats, because for ages, sheep have been considered good and goats have been considered bad. This goes all the way back. I mean, even 1400 BC when Moses is talking. And if you remember the Hebrew word azazel, that on the day of judgment, the high priest would lay his hands on the head of a goat and send that goat into the wilderness to die. And Leviticus 16 says that the goat is sent out into the wilderness to Azazel. And we didn't know what the Hebrew word Azazel meant. And for a long time, they thought, I forget all the different things. There was a lot of machinations about what it could have been, blah, 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 blah. But because of the discovery of all the tablets here of late, tablets from other cultures and that kind of thing, the majority testimony of scholarship right now is Azazel means mighty goat. So you had the people of Israel, and then out there in the wilderness was the mighty goat. And who's that? Well, we know that's the devil. And even, in my tiny little stint in witchcraft, we all knew that the goat of Mendes was a personification of the devil. So goats, and you can Google this, but as far back as anyone's been able to tell, it's lost in the depths of history. Goats have been evil and the sheep have been good. And so here we have the sheep and the goats. And then it's also true that the right hand has been the hand of blessing and the left hand has been the hand of cursing. And what anchored that in society was people had to wipe their tail ends with either one hand or the other. And this was before toilets, before, toilet paper and all that stuff. So they would wipe their butt with one hand, and that was always the left hand. And then everybody always ate with their right hand. So the left hand became the hand of cursing, the right hand became the hand of blessing. And so he sets the sheep, verse 33, on his right, the goats on his left, verse 34, and then the king will say to the ones on his right. Now that should jump out on us, because this is the first time that Christ speaks of himself and calls himself the king. If you go like with the trial in Pontius Pilate, Christ said, "My kingdom is not of the world." But he didn't exactly specifically say. He implied it strongly enough we know it's true, but he didn't call himself the king. He never said, "I am the king." Here, verse 34, he says, "Then the king." And Christ does say he is the king. So he's going to say to the ones on his right, "Come, you who have been blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom that's been prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And again here in verse 34, remember, this is the judgment. And so he says, "Come, you who have been blessed by my Father." So when Jesus Christ talks about judging, he says he's the judge, but he's been entrusted to judge by his Father. Let's go to John chapter 5. And in John chapter 5, Jesus Christ here is in a discussion. And he says in verse 19, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son is not able to do anything on his own, but only what he sees his Father doing." Now that's going to be true when it comes to the judgment, because he's going to say in verse 27, well, let's just go back to verse 26, "For as the Father has life in himself, so he, the Father, has also given to the Son to have life in himself." So the Son can judge between life and death. Verse 27, "And he gave him authority to execute judgment because he's the Son of Man," meaning I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God, so God gave me authority to judge. And then he says, verse 28, "Don't be amazed at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice." This will be the first and second resurrections. Verse 29, "And will come out, those who've done good things to the resurrection of life, those who've practiced evil to the resurrection of condemnation. And there's the difference between everlasting life and everlasting death. Verse 30, in the context of judging, he says, I'm not able to do anything on my own. As I hear, I judge. And my judgment is righteous because I do not seek to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. So this is a huge key to what's going on in Matthew chapter 25, because in Matthew 25, when Christ is judging, and now he's judging the sheep, the righteous, he says to the ones on his right, verse 34, come, you who've been blessed by my Father. So here's our indication that Christ was listening to God and judging in accordance with what he had heard from the Father, because it's the Father who knows all people, knows their hearts, that kind of thing. So Christ is the one sitting on the throne, actually making the pronouncement, but he's hearing the information from his Father. He taught us that in John 5 when he was talking about doing the judging in the future. Now he talks about that in Matthew 25 when he's talking about actually doing the judging. So he says, come, you've been blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom. Verse 35, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in, naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Verse 37, then the righteous will answer him saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and fed you, or thirsty and gave you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and took you in, or naked and clothed you? When did we see you sick or in prison and came to you? Verse 40, and the king answering will say to them, truly I say to you, whatever you did for one of these brothers or sisters of mine, even the least of them, you did for me. And remember that in a stratified culture, like you had in the ancient Near East, you had the king at the top, and then you had, the people under him, the nobles, and then you had the equestrian class, they called it, the knights, and you went down through. Then you had just the regular poor people, and then you had the slaves, and very stratified culture, and it was. Usually the people in the lower classes were treated incredibly poorly, just incredibly poorly. And so it wasn't even really considered like an unusual thing that somebody of the upper classes wouldn't give the time of day to somebody in the lower classes, wouldn't help them. That was just a very strict stratification. And here, see, we don't live in that kind of society. So for us, when we see that you did this for the least of them, we're like, well, yeah, they're human beings. Yeah, I get it. There's some people that are down on their luck. And in a stratified society, in fact, my wife and I are watching a series now. It's a Netflix series called Poldark about the late 1700s, the early 1800s, very stratified society, and you have the poor people, and they're literally starving to death, and they're having discussions among the gentry, and you have people in the gentry saying, well, why should we help them? Who's interested in them anyway? And that was very much the attitude that would go back. That kind of attitude went back to the time of Christ. So for Christ here to point out to these good people and say, you helped the least of them, is talking about something that really shows an expression of heart and love and giving that is way beyond what your average gentle person or your average royalty would ever consider doing. And that becomes important. And I'm going to come back to this in just a minute, because we're going to see the other side. Verse 41, he will say to the ones on the left hand, depart from me, you who are cursed. And the way cursed is handled in the Greek text, if you read the scholars and the commentaries, it can be also translated, you who are under a curse. And then if you go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 28 about the things that people that, if you don't obey God and turn away from him, blah, 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 and you receive curses, then that's more or less what this is talking about. Depart from me, you who are under a curse. And let's see. Yeah, I'll go back. 41. I'll say to the ones on the left hand, depart from me, you who are under a curse, into the fire in the age to come, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. So here we see the fire in the age to come, and it already exists. But this sheep and goat judgment is later than the judgment at the Battle of Armageddon, because Christ comes down and fights the Battle of Armageddon. And that's when the Antichrist and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Then Christ sends out his angels and gathers all the survivors from Armageddon. And that's what this judgment is. So by the time these goats are being judged, there already are the beast and the false prophet in the lake of fire. Now let's go to Daniel real quick. I want to go to Daniel and show you this about the judgment, because in Daniel chapter 7, this is where we're going to run into the lake of fire. So Daniel chapter 7, and we'll go to let's go to verse 8. We'll just pick up some quick context. So this is talking about this beast of the end times. It's here in Daniel chapter 7. It's in the book of Revelation. It's got 10 horns and all this other stuff. Verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, awesome and powerful and exceeding strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, stamped the residue with its feet. This is important. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. When it's different from all the beasts that were before it, the Antichrist will rule a kingdom that is unlike any kingdom that has been before. I know that it's taught, and I think I taught this by myself a number of years ago, that this fourth kingdom was an extension of the Roman Empire, and it's not. This is a different empire that is run by the Antichrist himself, and it's different from the kingdoms that had come before it. And when we see the ascendancy of the Antichrist take place, what the kingdom that he sets in place will be different from the other kingdoms that have existed on earth. Verse 8, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, and that is the Antichrist, is the little horn. And I don't have the time to develop that now, but you can read the commentaries here in Daniel. Before which the first horns were plucked up by the roots. Behold, the horn, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, a mouth speaking great things. This is where we're headed. Verse 9, I watched until thrones were set in place. This is the judgment. We see that God sits on a throne at the judgment, and then there are other elder spirit beings that judge along with God. This apparently has something to do with God's divine counsel. So Daniel is getting to watch this by revelation. The Antichrist is speaking great things, but thrones are set in place. And then it says, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. The Ancient of Days is God. So here it describes him in Daniel's vision. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels burning fire. Verse 10, a river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. This is God's judgment, which is going to involve a lot of wrath. So now, for the first time, we see God in judgment, sitting on his throne. Flowing out from his throne is a river of fire. And it says, and we know what happens with rivers. They go downhill until finally they either run into the sea or they find a low place and they pool up and create a lake. And that's apparently what happens. This river of fire comes out from in front of the throne of God, in the presence of God, and flows away, and then will form the lake of fire into which ungodly people were thrown. And so The river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Verse 10, thousands of thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated. These are these elder spirit beings, and the books were opened. And then verse 11, I kept looking because of the sound of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. Again, that's the Antichrist. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and it was given over to the burning fire. And that was in Revelation chapter 19. And so this is a picture of the judgment and the Antichrist being thrown into the lake of fire. Now we can hop back to Matthew chapter 25. So that's why verse 41 says, Christ the King says to the ones who are cursed, the ones on his left hand, the goats, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the fire in the age to come, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels, but wasn't prepared for people because God's desire was that all people be saved. But not all people want to go that way. Verse 42, for I was hungry and you did not give me anything to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger and you did not invite me in, naked and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. In verse 44, and they will also saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not serve you? Now, this is intriguing because that's very similar to verse 37. The righteous answer him saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and fed you, or thirsty and gave you drink? And so we've got the righteous people who said, Lord, when did we see you hungry? And then you have the unrighteous people saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty? In verse 44. So you got verse 37, the righteous saying the same thing as the wicked, the goats do in verse 44. So what's the difference? This is kind of interesting because neither set, not the righteous or the ungodly, really realized, according to this parable, that what they were doing was serving Jesus Christ. The sheep, the godly people, just they had love, they had compassion, they looked at the needy and they saw the need, they looked at the downcast, the discouraged, the disadvantaged, they saw the need, and they came out of their shell, so to speak. They discomforted themselves, they sacrificed whatever they needed to help those people, not knowing it was helping the Lord, but to them it was like, you've got to help people. And it comes out of a heart of love with a vision of, I'm here, I can help. The goats say the same thing. When did we see you hungry? Except what they're saying is, Lord, gosh, if we knew it was you, we probably would have helped. But those people in the Keith Green song, The Sheep and the Goats, he says, you're not one of those creepy people at the door, are you? And that's the way the goats felt about their fellow human being. They just had no compassion. They said, maybe Jesus, maybe if we knew it was you, we might have helped. But you're not one of those creepy people, are you? And so it's a real contrast to me that we are privileged to get to know that when we are extending ourselves, and here we are coming into the holiday season. If you're in the same boat I'm in, I'm already getting almost in every mail of almost every single day, there's some letter from some organization that's asking for money. And Genevieve and I help in several of those. We don't help everyone, but there are several that we help and give money to. And then, of course, the STF and the church and that Genevieve and I go to sometimes and that kind of thing. This is a great time of giving and helping and blessing. So anyway, they say to Jesus, when did we see you hungry and in prison And verse 45, he says, truly I say to you, insofar as you did not do it to one of these least, you did not do it to me. Verse 46, and these will go away into the punishment in the age to come, but the righteous into life in the age to come. And those are the two doors in the future. We're either going to live forever or people are going to die forever. And it's our privilege and blessing to be in the family of God, to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ, and to help bring people into a perspective where they can live forever instead of die forever. So this concludes a three-part teaching on Matthew 24 and 25, but it's been a super blessing to do the research, and thank you for being here with me for this. And I guess, Rob, I feel I just have to say this, reading so many different times over and over from the Old Testament and the New Testament about how real the judgment is, how God has warned us and warned us and warned us and begged us to get saved and urged us to get saved. God has really extended himself. He could have just said it one time. This is how you get saved. You either get saved or you die forever. And he said, there, it's in your hands. But he didn't. He's so compassionate. All through the Old Testament, all through the parables of Christ, he has extended himself to try to get people to get the picture. It's easy to get into the kingdom. It's easy to live forever. Jesus Christ died for us so it would be easy for us. And now we've just got to take that message to people. And this is a great time of year to do it. Thanksgiving and Christmas is a great time to tell people. So anyway, I'm rambling again. God bless you guys. Thank you for being here. I love you bunches.